Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and good day. Welcome to the CES Letters podcast. My name is Easton. I am joined here with Dr. Jamie Jensen. And Dr. Jensen is one of the smartest people ever. And before we get started, I just want to give a shout out and a recommendation and an invitation. Go read her letter in response to the topics we're talking about today. I know I say that every time, but genuinely, this is one of my favorite letters that we have published so far. So please go read that and go listen to her BYU Devotional. It's one of my favorite devotionals. So very good things. But Dr. Jensen is a professor in the Department of Biology at BYU. She is a discipline-based education researcher with dual expertise in biology and educational psychology and pedagogy. Her research foci include improving biology teaching through the use of evidence-based instructional practices and overcoming barriers at the intersection of evolution and religion through effective science communication strategies. Additionally, as a member of the broader Social Impacts Committee of the Human Origins Project at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, she works with scientists from a variety of religious denominations to help the public feel more comfortable with human evolution. And that's going to be one of our main topics today. We're going to be talking about science in general, but we're going to be talking a lot about human evolution and how that can interact with our faith journeys and so on and so forth. And so without further ado, my friends, I present to you Science and the CES Letter with Dr. Jamie Jensen. Dr. Jensen, how are you doing today?
I am great.
Good. I'm so glad you're here. I'm so excited for this episode. I'm excited to learn from you. The topics we're talking about today are things that I really enjoy studying and really enjoy learning about. So I feel like the questions I'm going to have are like my personal questions. And I hope that they're questions of the listeners as well, but they're going to be really my personal thoughts and questions. Before we get started, though, we want to get to know you a little bit. Okay. What's something about you that most people don't know?
So let's see. My husband and I met through online dating before online dating was a thing.
Wow. How did you even do online dating back then?
AOL with dial-up internet.
Wow.
Yep, I was at BYU and he was in Arizona, and our parents set us up. They met at an oyster bar in North Carolina on a Harley-Davidson ride.
Interesting.
And they set us up, and we started talking, and we talked back and forth through dial-up internet for a good few months before we met and fell in love. So
that is so cool. That should be like a world record. One of the earliest online dating. Yeah. Wow, that's so cool. And once you met up, how long did you guys date before you got married?
Let's see. We met in October and we were married the following May.
Oh, very cool.
Not very long.
Very, very cool. Very exciting.
We fell in love on our first date, so it was a match made in
tender.
heaven. But it was a unarranged marriage, we say.
A little bit.
Yeah.
And where all did you study? It was for your undergrad and your graduate school.
I did my bachelor's at BYU. Cool. When I started at BYU, I thought I was going to be a vet. So my major was animal science, dairy production. And then I kind of changed my focus, thought I liked human medicine more. And I had a dear cousin who broke his neck and is a quadriplegic. And so I decided I wanted to actually do research on spinal cord rehabilitation. Wow. So I did a master's at BYU in developmental biology and molecular evolution. And then I started a program at Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona. They had a great bioengineering program on spinal cord rehabilitation. And so I started in heart development, actually, was where I started.
Wow.
And then I found my love of teaching and didn't realize that was something you could actually do research in. Oh, cool. And so I met a very famous guy. His name is Tony Lawson. I don't know how many people know him, but he's really famous in education circles. And he was at Arizona State University. And I met him, and he convinced me to study educational psychology. So I ended up doing my PhD in biology, but with a focus in discipline-based education research.
That is so interesting. That is all across the board.
I was all over the place.
That is so cool. Very, very learned. I like that a lot.
Yeah.
So as we dive in, I want to start with just a couple of quotes from the CES letter itself. Mm-hmm. And it's actually the author, Jeremy Reynolds. He's quoting other things, and then we'll dive into some of your responses towards this. Henry Eyring. Henry the member of our First Presidency's dad, he said, "Since the gospel embraces all truth, there can never be any genuine contradictions between true science and true religion. I am obliged as a Latter-day Saint to believe whatever is true regardless of the source." But then we take that and we juxtapose that with these other quotes, quoting the Bible dictionary. And first it says, Latter-day Revelation teaches that there was no death on this earth before the fall of Adam. Indeed, death entered the world as a direct result of the fall. And then it also tells us that the fall of Adam and Eve was at 4000 BC. So there's some contradictory information there.
Sure.
And so as we dive in, the first thing I actually want to talk about, and you discussed this a lot in your BYU Devotional, is what is truth? And as we're trying to discover the truth about religion and science, could you give us just a simple rundown of what is truth and how can you determine scientific truth versus religious truth? Or
Sure, yeah. And I think going back to Henry Eyring's quote, it was not an invitation to bring science and religion and have them compete. And I think that's part of what people misunderstand, is that, truth is much bigger than you can discover through science or religion. There's several epistemologies, or ways of knowing. That's a fancy word for just ways of knowing. And so science is an epistemology that just is concerned with the natural world. So things here on Earth, things that live and die, and biology especially, live and die and breathe, and looking at natural phenomena, things that we can have a natural explanation for. And so there are limitations to what questions science can answer and what questions it can't answer. And then religion is an epistemology as well, dealing more with the supernatural. Now, sometimes people look at that word as sort of a bad connotation, that it's make-believe. And that's not what I mean. I just mean above the natural world. Things outside of the natural realm is what religion is looking for truth in that area. And so if we try to answer each other's questions, sometimes that's where conflict arises. But I mean, let's be honest here, and I want to be very sensitive to the fact that this intersection is tricky and it's been confusing for a lot of people. So if you're having doubts about things that seem to not mesh together, don't feel like you're alone. This is a very, very tricky intersection, especially if you're not an expert in one or the other epistemology.
Right. It can get very confusing very quickly.
Yeah.
And what I love, we talk about this so often here on the podcast, is, as it says in Doctrine and Covenants, seek learning by study and by faith.
Yeah.
Let's combine those. The Bible is not a science book. It's not a history book. It's not teaching us scientific things. There may be scientific aspects about it. There might be historical aspects, but that's not what it's trying to do. It's trying to teach us religious and spiritual things, how to become like Jesus Christ, and vice versa. Science isn't necessarily teaching us religious things. It's not teaching us about God, although there is some overlap between the two. So I love that answer. We're going to first dive in to death before the fall.
Sure.
Okay. And so as I just mentioned, there were those two quotes from the Bible dictionary. Latter-day Saint Revelation teaches us that there was no death on this earth before the fall of Adam. And then the fall of Adam was placed at 4000 BC in the chronology of the Old Testament. Let's first talk. What is the Bible dictionary?
What is the Bible
that doctrine?
dictionary?
Is that scripture that we're talking about?
Yeah, so the easiest place to look is the introduction to the Bible dictionary itself, that's in our canonized scriptures that most members have. And the Bible dictionary is not canonized scripture. It's not meant to represent the church's position on things. And the Bible dictionary was largely borrowed from a Cambridge University Press supplemental Bible dictionary. And so there's a lot of things in there that are meant, and again, thinking about what's the point of the Bible dictionary? It's supposed to help you learn these spiritual things. Again, the Bible dictionary is not meant to be a scientific treatise on what is and is not. And so if you look at it that way, it is not doctrine. And so some things in there may seem to not quite make sense with what the science says, and that's just because it's not meant to be a science book.
And it's okay for it to maybe be incorrect on some things.
Yeah.
Because it's not meant to be perfect on on everything.
That's right.
So and one of the authors of it was Robert J. Matthews, who is so smart, one of the smartest guys I think, in the history of the church. But at the same time, he doesn't live now in 2024. He isn't constantly updating it. One of the important things I think about both the church and science is we're continually learning. We're continually adapting. And this Bible dictionary has largely stayed the same since 1980, 1979.
It's old. And if it came from Cambridge, it's even older than that.
Right.
And I think, too, a lot of the statements that people bring up about evolution, the creation, human history, even by members of the church, were made long before most of what we know now about the history of the earth and the history of creation and the history of humans. We didn't even know scientifically.
So let's dive into the question. Was there death before the fall?
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good.
From a scientific lens, there was natural physical death of organisms before the fall.
Okay.
And that's another thing that's a little confusing, right? When we're talking about no death before the fall, are we talking about physical death of organisms?
Right.
Are we talking about spiritual death, being taken from the presence of God? What are we talking about with death? But as far as scientifically, was there physical death? There's been physical death of organisms on the earth for upwards of 3.6 billion years.
Very interesting. So let's dive into that, maybe just as some contextual information. 3.6 billion years ago, what happened? How did it start from a scientific lens? And again, different things, but from a scientific lens, let's go
from a
from
scientific
there to
lens,
today.
we do know that the earth coalesced as far as solid matter being together around 4.6 billion years ago. And we know this from plenty of different sources of evidence, including radiometric dating, not carbon dating. A lot of people like to say carbon dating, but carbon is way too young. We use uranium, lead, or potassium, argon dating to look at how old that is. So we know that the earth is really old. We also have the first fossil evidence of living organisms, which were single-celled organisms, upwards of 1.5 to 3.5. It's sort of a mushy number. That's a huge amount in billions of years.
Right.
But it depends on what you're looking at and what the fossil is. But we do believe that life has been on the planet upwards of around 3.5 billion years. Now, the origin of life, it's still being scientifically studied, right? We don't know exactly. There are some good hypotheses about sort of the idea that self-replicating molecules came together like RNA and then got encased in a lipid bubble and we get sort of the beginnings of cells. But as far as how that actually happened, there's actually several theories about that, including it coming from another planet as like a meteorite. Right. So we don't know exactly how it started, but we do know it started a long time ago.
So I hear all the time when we talk about science, the phrase Big Bang Theory. And maybe that's a good TV show, but will you help us explain scientifically, what is that? Is that still the believed in theory today?
And that's even
what
farther
does that
back.
mean?
So let's go all the way back to the beginning of the universe, more like 14.5 billion years ago. That's the Big Bang, right? So matter, there was a Big Bang.
Right.
There was an explosion of matter and light, and it's continually been expanding. And we know this from, they can look at the expansion of the universe. And now this is going outside my field. You'd have to ask an astronomer. But we know from expansion of the universe about how long it's been expanding. And we estimate it's been around 14 billion years since the Big Bang. So the Earth didn't coalesce until 4.5 billion years ago.
10, 11 billion years of holy cow.
Of nothing, right?
Wow.
Of matter flying in all directions, but not Earth.
Okay, so 4 billion years ago, 4 billion years ago, matter started, organisms started replicating, and that's what we have. What happened after that? What does evolution look like from a scientific method?
Yeah, so single-celled organisms, they're on Earth 3.5 maybe billion years ago, and eventually we get multicellularity. And then we get photosynthesis happening that changes the atmosphere drastically so that things aren't always in the ocean. They climb onto land where the atmosphere is more oxygen rich. We get plants and animals, insects, arthropods climbing onto land. And then from there, you get this huge explosion, right? And we kind of know the history of the dinosaurs and everything else. The dinosaurs get wiped out by a meteorite 65 million years ago, which kind of opens up the land for mammals that were already there, but they were small and outcompeted by giant reptiles.
Right.
And once they're gone, we get mammals. But hominins, they're not showing up on the scene until much more recent time.
Right. So could you define for us, that's going to be the other topic we're talking about,
Sure.
is multiple hominid species in Neanderthal DNA present in Adam's descendants. What is a hominid? What is multiple hominid? What does that mean for our
Sure.
listeners?
So if you look at the genus Homo, that's our genus. So we are Homo sapiens. And it's funny, it's with an S. So you are a Homo sapiens with an S.
Oh, interesting. I did not know that.
Homo is the genus, sapiens is the species.
Interesting.
But if you look at hominids, that's generally a term we use for all of the great apes that are alive today. So that includes gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans. Those are all hominids. Now, if you're thinking about like caveman that people think about, that's hominin.
Okay.
And so that's going to be Homo sapiens and our most recent ancestors, which includes several genuses. There's Homo, which is, you've heard of Neanderthal, or Homo erectus, or Homo naledi is one of the most recent ones. And then we have some sister genuses like Australopithecus. So Lucy, the famous Lucy, is an Australopithecine. We have Paranthropus. We have Sahelanthropus. There's several different kind of sister clades that didn't survive, but Homo is our genus.
So is this like the famous picture of the gorilla up to the standing human?
Which is a terrible picture because it's not accurate, right? But yeah. So these are all of the, if you go to the Smithsonian Hall of Human Origins, you'll see all of these hominins that are close relatives that are on our, so if you, it's hard to do this without a picture, but 5 to 7 million years ago, there was an ancestral population of hominids, right? And they were separated somehow, either geographically or we have like behavioral separation as well. They were separated, and one of those lineages would eventually become chimpanzees and bonobos, which are our closest living relatives. And so there's a whole bunch of ancestors of chimpanzees and bonobos that look much more monkey-like, ape-like. And then along that other lineage leads up to what would eventually become Homo sapiens. And that line is the hominins. That's where you're going to find Neanderthals and Naledi and Lucy and all of those.
Very interesting. And it's Neanderthals, not thals?
So it's TH, but it's German, so it's Neanderthal, but Neanderthal works too.
So of these Neanderthals that came, are Homo sapiens the only ones that survived, or are there others that survived as well?
So as of now, as of current day, Homo sapiens are the only ones in the genus. So very rarely do we get only one species in the genus. We're not the only ones, but we're one of the only ones. But if you look at how many survive, so Homo neanderthal, so the official name is Homo neanderthalensis.
Oh, wow.
They were alive fairly recently on the scene. So
in comparison to the last 4 billion years.
So Homo sapiens, they arrived on the scene somewhere around 250 to 300,000 years ago. Okay. So that's at that, let's say it's at 250,000 years ago. At that time, there were other hominins still alive sharing the globe with us. So those were Homo neanderthalensis that was up in Europe. So when Homo sapiens emerged on the scene, they were in Africa. So they were still in Africa. Homo sapiens emerged in Africa. Homo neanderthalensis had already speciated and left Africa and made their way north, and they were up in Europe and Asia. We had Homo naledi, which we've just recently found that was alive upwards of 186,000 years ago, and they were down in South Africa as well, down around Johannesburg. And then we had Denisovans, which we know very little about. We only have a finger bone, but we have their DNA, so we know they were fairly close. And then we had Homo floresiensis, which was a little tiny species. We call them the hobbits. They were little. They were experiencing island dwarfism, and they were on the island of Flores in Indonesia. And they lived upwards of like 18,000 years ago. Don't quote me on these numbers because I get numbers all mixed up, but around 18,000 years ago, very recent. But modern Homo sapiens, as like, if you looked at them, you would recognize them as human. That's more around 150,000 years ago. So Naledi may have been gone, but Neanderthal was still around. Denisovans, we don't know their age range necessarily because we don't have as many fossils. And Floresiensis was still around.
Wow. And you said that Homo sapiens were in Africa.
They were in Africa.
What part of Africa?
Actually, I don't know. Olorgesailie is where we're seeing some of those early, I'm trying to think. I don't know exactly. I'd have to look it up.
That's okay.
Eastern Africa, I believe.
Okay, very cool.
Yeah.
So did they ever interact with the other?
So the only one that we have evidence of interacting is Neanderthal, because the only way to actually figure that out is either to find their skeletons like right on top of each other, which we don't generally find.
Right.
Fossils are so hard to find as it is. You're lucky if you find one. So to find those interactions, we don't necessarily see those. But the only other way to look at it is to see if there's DNA admixture. So was there mating? Can we see evidence of DNA? And DNA, because of its half-life, if you go back any farther than about 50,000 years, the DNA is no longer viable.
Makes sense.
We can't get those sequences. And so the only ones we can get sequences from are like Neanderthal, Floresiensis, Denisovan. And so with Neanderthal, we have been able to find markers of their DNA in modern human populations. So we know that Neanderthals and sapiens interacted and even interbred. The other ones, we're not sure. Like Naledi, we haven't been able to get the DNA yet. But we're looking at 186,000 years ago. So they're a little bit probably too old, but we still have hope that we might get their DNA.
This is so interesting.
Yeah.
So help us understand, how can this mesh with Scripture? For a lot of people, I have friends who do not, if they were listening to you, they'd be like, you're crazy. None of this is true. This is not what I heard from Bruce R. McConkie growing up. So how can we mesh this with what we've learned? How can we wrestle with some of this cognitive dissonance that some people may be experiencing?
So I have students ask me this. I mean, that's the most common question I get in my class. So what about Adam and Eve? And my answer always to them is, you know what? I'm going to let you decide. Right? I don't want to give you the only answer, but I can give you a lot of possibilities.
Cool.
Right? So we know that Adam and Eve, from modern revelation, we know that Adam and Eve were real people. They lived in the garden, but we don't know when, and we don't know where they got their bodies. So we know that Adam and Eve were spiritually created. We know that they were people. We know that they came to earth and took upon themselves an appropriate body. That's what it says.
Right.
They took upon themselves an appropriate body. And so what was that? There's a lot of different ways.
We know
it could be a homo. Yeah, we know it was in the image of God, right? So, but what does that mean? Were Neanderthals in the image of God? I mean, they're pretty darn close to us. And in fact, a lot of scientists would consider Neanderthals and sapiens the same species, since we could interbreed, right? That's one of the biological species concept says if you can interbreed. Although we think their most recent evidence suggests that there may be some sterility issues. So, and I always get this wrong, but I think it's if a male Neanderthal and a female sapiens interbred, their sons were sterile, something to that effect. So there was some sterility going on. So we were not totally compatible as a species.
Well, and let me just stop you. One of the things that I love so much that you just said is what most recent evidence is suggesting. Yeah. This is still coming. We're still learning. And as it should be with our faith, it should still be progressing. I just want to throw that out there.
I know, it's a good point. There's a lot we don't know, right? And we discovered, for instance, Naledi's only been discovered in the last, 10 years.
Oh, wow.
And we're still learning about Homo naledi and what their relationship was to sapiens. We don't know yet, right? And when I was down in South Africa on my sabbatical, I hung out around the caves in Johannesburg. And there's a cave called Gladysvale. Anyway, and there's another cave right now is named Site 105, which...
Such a boring name.
I know. It'll be something, but I have seen a pelvis that they discovered there that we don't even know what it is yet.
Oh,
it looks very much like an Australopithecine, if I were guessing, but I'm not
That's what I would have guessed too.
Yeah. So, yeah, there's still more we're learning all the time. So we don't know.
So cool.
Anyway, so back to Adam and Eve. So we know they took upon themselves a body. We know it was in the image of God, likely a sapiens, right? Whether they were a special case of creation in the garden, I'm totally cool with that.
Right.
There's no scientific evidence to suggest otherwise. So they could have been a special case, but patterned after what was already running around out there, right? Were they an evolved body that Heavenly Father brought into the garden and the spirit was placed in there? Possibly. Were they transplanted from another sphere as fully formed humans? Possible. We don't know. We don't know. Scientific evidence suggests there's not a bottleneck. like 6,000 years ago, right? Where people want to place Adam and Eve. There's not a bottleneck in the sapiens population. At that point in time, there were hundreds of thousands of sapiens running around.
Right.
And so, but you can, if you want to try to place Adam and Eve, there's a lot of science behind it. I don't know if you want me to go into that.
Yes,
it's in the
absolutely. Please
okay.
do.
So as far as if we wanted to place Adam and Eve in a certain spot. So one of the things you have to sort of understand is that in genetics, so you are a product of your mom and your dad. And so, but that means if you looked at your DNA, only 50% of your DNA came from your dad and 50% came from your mom. So if you look at your dad's DNA, you only share 50% of it with him. So he's got DNA that you don't have as a parent.
Oh, interesting.
Right? Because he only gave you half of his DNA.
Right.
And so if you keep going back generation after generation, as soon as like 10 ancestors ago, you can have an ancestor that is your genealogical ancestor. They are a direct ancestor and you share 0 of their DNA. So you're not related to them.
Wow.
Genealogically, you're related to them. Genetically, you're not related to them.
Holy cow.
And so trying to trace DNA back to Adam and Eve would be impossible. But
one other thing that I just like to throw out that I hear so often that I think is very important is we talk about the endowment, the temple endowment, which the presentation of the endowment is basically a movie about Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
That is not scientifically accurate.
No, it's all symbolic.
In every single way. It's all symbolic. There's so many things that we could go into, but I hear that all the time as an argument of, well, this happens in the...
Well, and I love that people want to say, I mean, it's a movie, guys. So let's think about when the church was even restored. They didn't have a movie.
Right.
This movie is an interpretation by someone today, even interpreting Joseph Smith's words.
Exactly.
And Woodruff. President Woodruff. Wilford Woodruff. There you go.
Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah, I was going to say the president, Woodrow Wilson. Wilford Woodruff, he's the one that sort of helped that temple endowment come to be. And he had to interpret what he received from Joseph Smith. And then people today made a movie. But you see things in the movie where it's like artistic license.
So much of it. So much of it.
Because there wasn't a movie when Joseph Smith received the endowment.
Sorry, that was just one little thing that I hear arguments of by my friends all the time. They're
people
like, well,
read too much into that.
But that's not what it is.
It is symbolic.
Sorry, continue.
So anyway, Adam and Eve. So scientifically, if you wanted to go back using the rules we know about genealogy and how quickly we lose DNA and how much variation in the DNA exists today in modern populations. Okay, so there's some fancy genetics and mathematics going into this. But if you were to trace it back to an ancestor that everyone on Earth today could point to and say, this is a genealogical ancestor. So not genetic, right? Because that's impossible.
Right.
But a genealogical ancestor of everyone on Earth, you could maybe put that population 5,000 years ago.
Okay.
But that means that doesn't include all the DNA variants that are in people. It just would mean we could all at least trace an ancestor to 5,000 years ago. If you want to capture all of that variation in humans, then we need to go back 20 to 30,000 years to say, okay, here's a population that would encompass all the genetic variety, including all the races and ethnic diversity we have on Earth, maybe 20 to 30,000 years ago. So was that Adam and Eve?
Right.
Potentially.
Well, and Hugo Perego, who we just recently had on, he said that the first people to come live here in the Americas was around 18 to 20,000 years ago. Yeah. And so there's so much variety in this.
Yeah. And if you go any farther back than about 18,000 years ago, then we've got humans aren't even living, a lot of them are in Africa still. And so the variation, like this light colored skin you see in people, that's more recent, right? As we move towards the North and South Pole and needed more vitamin D, and there's a whole bunch of science that goes behind that, our skin tone lightened. But if you go back 150,000 years ago, we had darker skin. Yeah. Yeah. So 5,000 years ago, maybe 20 to 30,000 years ago, if you're going to include Neanderthals, because we interbred, then you got to go back in the hundreds of thousands of years ago. If it's all sapiens, then we're going back 250, 300,000 years ago. Any of these places, you could potentially say, oh, that is where Adam and Eve were, or that's where Adam and Eve were. Any of those would work. There's no science. It's a different epistemology, right? Adam and Eve is more of a spiritual thing.
Right.
And so we can't really say, as far as they have done genetic studies trying to look at the variation in mitochondrial DNA, which comes through the maternal line, and Y chromosome DNA that comes from the paternal line. And that takes us back 150 to 300,000 years ago to an Adam and Eve, which actually if you trace those back, Adam and Eve lived like 150,000 years apart,
Oh,
right?
wow.
If you trace the DNA. So doing it by DNA is probably not going to solve your problems or answer your question about Adam and Eve, because the DNA is complicated. And yeah, if you go back and listen to Ugo and all of the genetic admixture and genetic drift that we have, there's really no way to do it genetically. Genealogically, I mean, there's a couple places you could put them.
Right. I'd like to read a quote from, he was an apostle at the time, President Nelson, at the dedication of the BYU Life Sciences building. And you quoted this in your devotional, and I just loved it. It says, "There's no conflict between science and religion. Conflict only arises from an incomplete knowledge of either science or religion or both." Yeah. From what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, we have an incomplete knowledge of both in this instance. So how can we be okay with that? How can we still believe in Adam and Eve? How can we see him as a prophet, as one of the patriarchs, but still not know?
Right. So one of the things that I find is really interesting amongst our youth especially is this discomfort with uncertainty. And I shouldn't say it's unusual. As humans, and if we believe we evolved, that is one of our traits, right? We are not comfortable with uncertainty. If you were an early human and you were standing in the savannah and the grass rustled and you sat there and debated about what it was and were okay with uncertainty for a while, you probably didn't survive. Right. If you made a conclusion that I'm certain it's a lion and you ran, you lived, right? So we are programmed as humans to be very uncomfortable with uncertainty. But that's part of our intellectual development, is to become comfortable with uncertainty, because it turns out in science and religion, there's a lot we don't know. Right. And that's okay. Right. None of it is pertinent to your eternal salvation, first of all. Right. But there's a lot we still have to learn. So if you come across something that doesn't seem to mesh, as President Nelson said, it's probably because you just don't have enough information on one side or the other or both sides. And I would say that's probably the rule rather than the exception. Because of how much we don't know in science and religion, we just need to take a step back and pause and say, there's probably more I need to learn, and just be comfortable with that feeling of uncertainty until you learn more. And I would say, and I say this to students all the time, I actually have lots of conversations with students who are struggling with their testimonies. And I say, look, choose agnosticism over atheism. Right? If you're uncertain about this, be agnostic, which literally means without belief. I don't know. Right. I'm just going to wait and see, rather than deciding, oh, it must not be true. Because you don't have any more evidence that it's not true than you have evidence that it's true. Right. Right.
Lack of proof does not mean that it's completely false.
What's the quote? Let's see. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Exactly. Yeah. And you just reminded me of a quote from Elder Dale G. Renlund. This was from 2022, and he's talking about our Mother in Heaven. But what I love is he says, once you've read this section in the gospel library, this gospel topic, once you have read what is there, you will know everything that I know about the subject. I wish I knew more. You may still have questions and want to find more answers. Seeking greater understanding is an important part of our spiritual development, but please be cautious. Reason cannot replace revelation. We don't know on some of this, and we can think about it and we can wrestle on it, and those are so good and such an important thing. Steve Harper, he just released a book, I don't know, maybe 3 weeks ago, called Wrestle with the Restoration, or Wrestling with the Restoration. These are things to wrestle with. Yeah. But don't give up. Don't stop the fight just because you don't know the answers. Yeah. So Dr. Jensen, a question I have coming to you as a scientist, when you have questions or concerns, especially about science and the gospel, what do you do? How do you start your journey of learning by study and by faith?
Yeah. So first step, take a deep breath.
Okay. I love that step.
Don't jump to conclusions. And then study. So for me, and I'll just, get personal here. I have a hard time. No, I shouldn't say that. The way that I feel the Spirit is probably different than the way other people feel the Spirit. So for me, the sort of soft feelings and the warm sensation in your chest, that's not how I feel the Spirit. For me, the Spirit comes through logic and reason. And so when I have a question, I hit the books. I study everything there is. And I feel like it's a miracle when I find the right scientific article that I was looking for. That's where I feel like God is directing me. And so for me, and I think that's something that I've learned over time, because I used to struggle and think, gosh, I really don't feel the Spirit very well. Because my husband is more of he feels it deep in his heart, no logic, and it's good. Like he can recognize it and know. And I always feel like he's way more in tune. But then I started realizing it's just that God speaks to me in the way that my mortal body can handle. And my mortal body is much more left-brained, I suppose. And I'm more logical. And so anytime I've had problems with like questions about my children and how to deal with problems they might be having, or questions about the gospel, I hit the books and I pray for revelation in the form of research.
Wow.
Show me the data, right? And I've never been disappointed.
That is so cool. I love that. Seek learning out of the best books.
Yeah.
And you're discovering what those best books are for your answers.
Yeah.
That's really, really cool. Really, really interesting. Okay, there was just a couple. Oh, another thing here with evolution that I'd like to talk about is there have been church leaders in the past who have made claims about evolution or any of the things we've been talking about today that disagree with the science.
Sure.
How can you deal with that cognitive dissonance of looking at a prophet or apostle and recognizing, oh, they're a prophet, seer, and revelator, but they also said something that definitely is completely wrong? You know, like, how do you deal with that?
One of the things first is that I usually admire all of these people and have to realize that they were making a statement based on the best available information they had. So Joseph Fielding Smith, for instance, he's one that has spoken out against evolution. But at the time, there wasn't a whole lot more information that he, I mean, looking at the information today, I doubt he would have said maybe some of the things that he said then. And so recognizing that, you know, just like it's the same thing with Moses and the creation account.
Right.
The way the creation account is written, it's written based on the science of the times. And if you go look up ancient cosmology, where it's a flat disk earth sitting on the pillars of heaven with water above and water beneath, like a snow globe, right? And so when you read the way that Moses described it, it makes complete sense given what they understood at the time.
Right.
And it turns out it's completely wrong.
Right.
There are not waters above and waters beneath, and
Exactly.
it just doesn't work that way.
We talked about that a lot with Stephen Smoot. He came on and talked about the Book of Abraham and the cosmology of that time. And it wasn't science-based. It was based off of what they thought that they knew, off of the science they could do, but it's definitely not true. And the scriptures, or the temple endowment even talks about, I don't remember the word that it uses.
Oh, yeah.
Is
it the windows of heaven?
Something
we have a
to
scripture
that
about, about tithing. They open the windows of heaven. Right?
And that is water coming out of space. Right. Which the last time I went to space, I don't remember being stuck in water.
Surrounded by water. And that's what you have to keep in mind, is that a lot of these statements about evolution are fairly dated. Right. And they were given at a time when we didn't have a whole lot otherwise, but we know from the First Presidency's Christmas message, 1910, right, that which we can demonstrate, we accept with joy. And at the time, not a lot had been demonstrated with evolution. Now, do we still hear statements from apostles or leaders, maybe not apostles, but leaders about anti-evolution today? Sure. And I would say the same thing here. Even though we do have the information, you can't expect all of them to be an expert on everything. Just because they're an apostle does not make them an expert on all the sciences. And so I guess I would say to people, have a little bit of compassion. Right. And realize that they're people too. Right. And they're doing the best they can.
Right. I love your point of they were working off the information that they had. Yeah. And today we are a more correlated church. We have a lot more checks and balances that go into things. And I love in your article, you quote the Church's magazine to youth, The New Era, which this was a more recent statement. And they say, though the details of what happened on earth before Adam and Eve, including how their bodies were created, have not been revealed, our teaching regarding man's origin are clear and come from revelation. Before we were born on earth, we were spirit children of heavenly parents with bodies in their image. God directed the creation of Adam and Eve and placed their spirits in their bodies. We are all descendants of Adam and Eve, our first parents, who were created in God's image. There were no spirit children of Father on earth before Adam and Eve were created.
Yeah.
And so that is one thing that we can say we know, but how
Yeah.
does that work with the others? Who knows?
Yep.
And some of this we may learn at some point. We may have President Nelson might come out in April General Conference and say, listen to what I have found out. Listen to what God told me. But until that happens, or until science catches up, or until what our religious knowledge catches up, we need to be okay with some of that.
Yeah, we need to be
uncertainty,
patient.
some of that dissonance. What are we missing here? What else should we be hitting for our listeners?
I think I might just put in a plug for the importance of being scientifically literate.
Okay.
As far as obviously, if this is a point of tension for you that's making you doubt your faith, totally ignore me. This is not important, right? Doubt your doubts before you doubt your faith, as President Uchtdorf would say. So this is not important in that regard. Not important for your eternal salvation. But I do think as a church, we are an incredibly intelligent people. And I don't want us to shy away from science. So just because evolution is saying this, don't let your faith make you shy away from the science, just like you don't let the science make you shy away from your faith. And evolution is such an important concept. It's the foundational theory of biology. And there's so many things about current medical knowledge and life-saving treatments and conservation efforts and all of the things that we benefit from that are built on a foundation that things evolved, right?
Would it be accurate in a religious tone almost to say that evolution is a type of keystone where a lot of other biological science rests on?
It very much is. Yeah. And so it's always frustrating to me when people just want to I don't know, maybe burying your head in the sand is a little too harsh, but saying, I just don't want to think about it. I don't want to talk about it. And that's fine. If it's affecting your faith, I don't want you to talk about it or think about it. But if we want to have medical advancements and make the world a better place, we need to be scientifically literate.
Right.
So if you can handle it, you ought to learn about it. Because honestly, when I study evolution, I feel like I'm studying the hand of God. I'm studying the way that he created. It's fascinating. It doesn't diminish my faith. It just makes me more in awe of our Creator.
He's created this divine blueprint,
and it's incredible. Yeah.
And I love you quoted Elder Uchtdorf, doubt your doubts before you doubt your faith.
Yeah.
Another thing I'd like to throw in that I always like to say is doubt your doubts before you doubt your faith, but doubt your assumptions pretty quickly too.
Ooh, I love that.
Because we have so many assumptions. I grew up thinking evolution didn't exist. You grow up with assumptions about Joseph Smith and about the prophet and about fallibility of prophets and so many assumptions.
Yeah.
But let's doubt some of our assumptions. And as we always say here is recognize what you know and how do you know it. Is how you know it correct? Or is it just what your primary teacher taught you when you were 5 and you've grown up with that same
And
belief?
I think we need to practice just a whole lot of intellectual humility.
Right.
Yeah.
Confidence, humility is what I like. Like, be confident about what you know, but be confident to recognize what you don't know and deny it sometimes. One final question I'd like to ask Dr. Jensen is, why do you continue to be a Latter-day Saint? You're a scientist. How do you continue in your faith and as a disciple of Jesus Christ?
Yeah. So, simple answer is it makes my life better, right? Knowing what I know about the gospel enhances my life. And I look at my fellow scientists who aren't members of the church and I have the knowledge that they have scientifically, and I have this whole other epistemology getting at truth that they don't have. And it's a blessing. And so for me, it only adds to my happiness and my purpose. And so, I don't have any doubts that the church is true and that this is the Lord's gospel. Yeah.
Well, amen. Do you have anything else you'd like to add before we conclude?
No, that's it.
Dr. Jensen, thank you. And I'd like to thank all of our listeners for joining us today. We invite you to share this with your friends, your family, subscribe, do what you know you should do in your life, learn what you know you should learn in your life. And most importantly, as I conclude this episode, I just want to reiterate, go and read the blog post. It's linked in the show notes of Dr. Jensen, and go listen to her BYU Devotional and continue your study. Keep learning. We didn't answer all of your questions, but I hope we gave some important perspective. We love you guys, and we will talk to you later.